I hadn't seen Daniel in over a year. Not since the court date, not since the dry, cold signing of the divorce papers in that beige office that smelled faintly of old coffee and desperation. We didn't yell or cry that day. That would have taken too much effort. We were two tired people saying, enough, without saying anything at all. And now, suddenly, on a rainy Sunday afternoon, he was at my doorstep again, holding a bouquet of daisies like we were still 23 and playing house. The knock came just as I was folding laundry. It was soft, hesitant, the kind of knock people use when they're not sure they're welcome. I ignored it at first, thinking maybe it was a neighbor or someone trying to sell something. But it came again. 3 short knocks, then a pause. My heart picked up. I didn't know why. Maybe I always had a sense when it was him, even after everything. When I opened the door and saw him, I didn't speak. I just stared. He looked the same, and somehow completely different. Daniel stood in the rain, hair wet, suit slightly wrinkled, like he'd walked from another life straight into mine. And in his hands, those same hands that had once held our daughter in the hospital, that had once slammed doors during late night fights, he held a bouquet of daisies. Daisies. My favorite. He remembered. And somehow that hurt more than if he'd forgotten. Hi, Liza, he said, voice lower than I remembered. No umbrella. No explanation. Just standing there like time hadn't moved. I stepped outside before I realized I was doing it, folding my arms. He didn't move to hug me. Didn't assume. Smart. I was driving through the neighborhood, he added, like this was casual, like we hadn't torn each other apart one therapy session at a time. I thought you moved out of state, I replied. He nodded. I did. I'm just back for a few things, and I thought maybe. He trailed off. The rain was falling harder now, soaking into my sleeves. I don't want to bother you, he said quickly. I had to see you. Why? I asked. He looked at the flowers, then back at me. I don't know. I keep thinking about everything. About us. He paused. I'm sorry, Liza. And those 3 words, landed heavier than I expected. I hadn't cried about Daniel in months. I thought I was past the phase where apologies could break me open again. But hearing him say that, so plainly, with no follow up or excuse, it cracked something. Not because I believed he changed, but because, for a moment, it felt like he remembered I was a person, not just a role he used to depend on. I'm not angry anymore, I told him. And it was true. I wasn't angry. I was just tired. Tired of the loop I'd lived in since the divorce. Trying to be fine. Trying to remember who I was before him. Tired of people asking, do you still talk to your ex? Tired of our daughter asking, why don't you and daddy live together anymore? He looked older now, slight lines under his eyes. A tension around his mouth that used to appear only during tax season or family dinners. I miss us, he said. And for the briefest second, I let myself imagine it. I imagined him coming inside, us sitting in the kitchen, maybe even laughing again. But then I remembered the silences, the kind that lasted days. I remembered the way he looked at me like I was a stranger in our own home. I remembered the nights I cried in the bathroom while he scrolled on his phone 5 feet away. I remembered who I had to become just to survive loving him. And suddenly the bouquet in his hand felt like a punchline. He handed me the daisies. I didn't take them. Not yet. Instead, I looked at him and said, this is unexpected, Daniel. I have a lot going on. I need to think. And with that, I stepped back inside and closed the door. Gently, not dramatically. But my hands were shaking because the storm I thought had passed but was knocking again was. The next morning, I found the daisies on my doorstep. They weren't in a vase or wrapped in fancy paper. just laid carefully on the welcome mat, still damp from the rain. He must have come back sometime after I closed the door. Quietly. No message, no knock, just flowers and absence. I picked them up, hesitated, and then, almost against my better judgment, brought them inside. I didn't put them in water. I left them on the kitchen counter like a question I didn't want to answer. The house felt different now. Not haunted exactly, tense, just full of something I couldn't name. A tension beneath the quiet, a heartbeat in the walls. I made coffee, stared at the flowers, and remembered things I didn't ask to remember, like the time we danced barefoot in the kitchen while pasta boiled over on the stove, or when he carried me to bed after I fell asleep on the couch with a migraine. The way he used to whisper, "You're the best thing in my life," when he thought I was asleep. And then, the other things. The fights, the silence, the endless evenings where we sat at the same table speaking in civil tones but not really hearing each other. The way my voice got smaller over time. The way I stopped recognizing myself. I didn't miss him. Not really. I missed the idea of us, the version I created when I needed to believe we were okay. And now he was back, stirring ashes I had carefully buried. For what? Closure? Forgiveness? A second chance? At lunch, my phone buzzed. Unknown number. I let it ring once, then twice, before curiosity won. "Hi, it's me, Daniel," the message read. "I know it's selfish, but could we talk? One real conversation, just us." He didn't push, didn't beg, just left it there like another flower on the doorstep. I stared at the screen for a long time, then typed and deleted half a dozen replies before finally sending, "Maybe, but not today." I didn't owe him anything, but I owed myself the truth. Whatever this was, I needed to understand what it meant, if anything. That night, after I put our daughter to bed, I sat alone at the kitchen table. The daisies were still there, drooping now, their stems limp, their petals curling at the edges. They were beautiful in a tired kind of way, like they tried their best to be bright, even as they faded. I didn't cry, I just felt heavy. Heavy with memories, heavy with the weight of who I used to be, of the woman I had to become after loving him. But there was also a strange lightness, like the air before a decision. I wasn't sure where the story would go, but I knew it wasn't over yet. After Mark left, I stood in the middle of my living room, surrounded by the sound of nothing, and for a long moment, I just listened to the way silence moved through a space when someone you loved had taken their presence with them. It wasn't peaceful, it wasn't soft, it was heavy and sharp at the same time, like the silence wanted to press into my chest and ask me what I was going to do next. I remember staring at the couch where we used to watch late night movies, where his feet would always end up in my lap, and wondering how it was possible that something so simple could feel so sacred in memory, and so broken now. I walked through every room slowly, deliberately, as if taking inventory of my life after him, noticing how many small things bore the imprint of our shared habits, our routines, our dumb little jokes, that no longer made me smile, just ache. His coffee mug was still on the drying rack. The bathroom mirror still had a faint smudge from where he used to lean too close while shaving. And in the closet, God, the closet, half of it was suddenly empty, like a hollowed out wound in my home. And I caught myself standing there, touching the air where his shirts used to be, wondering if he'd forgotten anything, or if he'd taken care to remove every trace of himself. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed with one pillow missing, the indentation of his head still present on the one he always used, and I found myself reaching toward it out of habit before pulling my hand back like I'd burned myself. I hated that my body remembered things before my heart could forget them. I hated that I still listened for his keys at the door, even though I'd handed him the spare set that morning without ceremony, without tears, like I was fine. I wasn't fine. I was grieving someone who was still alive, grieving a life we'd dismantled brick by brick. And even though I'd helped take it apart, it didn't make the loss any less real. I started talking to myself out loud, narrating my morning like I was hosting a cooking show or a podcast, just to fill the space with something human. "Good morning, Lisa," I'd say. "Today we're making sad toast and wondering why we thought we were so special." I laughed at my own voice, not because it was funny, but because it was either that or cry again, and I was tired of crying in rooms where the walls already knew all my secrets. The first time I went grocery shopping alone, then I had a panic attack in the cereal aisle. I saw his favorite granola, the one I hated, but always bought for him anyway, and it hit me like a punch. Not just the fact that he wasn't with me, but the realization that I didn't have to consider him anymore. I didn't have to ask myself, will he eat this? Or should I get the almond milk for his stupid protein shakes? And somehow, the freedom felt more like abandonment than liberation. I left the cart in the middle of the aisle and cried in the car for 20 minutes before I could drive home. But slowly, I started doing things that belonged only to me. Reading books he would have rolled his eyes at, watching shows I never suggested before because I knew he'd call them too slow. Painting again, even though I hadn't touched a brush in years. I lit candles just for myself, wore lipstick while vacuuming, played music loud, and danced barefoot in the kitchen, allowing myself to exist in a space without shrinking to accommodate someone else's comfort. Friends checked in, but I didn't always answer. I appreciated the concern, but grief had turned me into something raw, like a wound with no scab, and I didn't want to be witnessed in that state. Not out of shame, but because explaining it felt like trying to teach someone a language you yourself barely understood. I needed time to understand what I was becoming without him. I needed space to grieve, to rage, to forgive myself for the things I'd ignored, the ways I'd stayed silent to keep the peace, the way I'd bent myself into a version of me that he could love without ever asking if I loved her too. One afternoon, weeks later, I found an old voice message from him. It wasn't anything special. He was asking if I could pick up lemons on the way home, but the sound of his voice, so casual, so familiar, brought me to my knees in the kitchen. I played it 3 times. Then I deleted it. I didn't want ghosts haunting me from the phone in my pocket. I didn't want to romanticize the mundane just because I missed being loved. I wanted to move on, and I needed to remember that moving on didn't mean forgetting. It just meant choosing myself every single day, no matter how hard that was. Eventually, I rearranged the furniture. I bought new sheets. I replaced the coffee mugs. These weren't grand acts of closure, but they were small rebellions, quiet declarations that I was reclaiming the space, inch by inch, moment by moment. I began to breathe a little easier, to smile without guilt, to remember who I was before I was his wife. And every time I caught myself looking at the door, imagining him walking through it with an apology or a smile or another story to tell, I reminded myself that the only person I was waiting for now was me. I wish I could say that when I saw him again, standing there on my doorstep with a bouquet of sunflowers and that same stupid, hopeful tilt to his smile. I didn't feel anything, but the truth is, my stomach twisted in a way I hadn't felt in years, the kind of nausea that memory alone can summon. He looked older, of course, tired around the eyes, lines deeper, maybe even humbled, but the moment he opened his mouth and said, "Hey, Liz, can we talk?" In that familiar voice, I remembered every lie that voice had whispered late at night while I lay awake pretending not to hear the pings on his phone. I didn't let him in, not right away. I just leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed, heart guarded like a soldier returning to a war zone she never meant to re-enter. And I said, "You've got about 5 minutes before I change my mind." He handed me the flowers like a peace offering, and for a brief second, I hated that a part of me still knew they were my favorite. Not roses, not lilies, but bright, reckless sunflowers that didn't beg for love, just bloomed wildly wherever they were planted. We sat outside on the porch, neutral ground, where the wind could carry away his excuses, and he started with the words I thought I always wanted to hear. I was wrong, followed by a laundry list of revelations I could have used back when I was crying into the washing machine because he couldn't be bothered to come home on time. I listened, politely like a woman who'd outgrown her appetite for apologies, nodding when appropriate, but inside I was watching a slideshow of all the nights I begged for honesty, only to be met with gaslight and cold shoulders that burned worse than fire. He told me he hadn't dated anyone seriously since me, as if that was supposed to be romantic, as if his loneliness was a tribute instead of a consequence, and I wanted to laugh because that was just like him. turning regret into a performance, expecting applause. I think about you all the time, Ahat, he said, eyes searching mine like he was fishing for hope. But I gave him none because I'd spent years rebuilding the version of me he tried to break, and she was no longer hungry for recycled affection. The audacity of him to speak of love now, after bearing it under so many casual betrayals, felt almost comical, like a man showing up to the ruins of a house he burned down, asking if we could maybe live there again. But here's the part that surprised me. I didn't feel angry anymore, not really. I felt tired, the kind of tired that comes from carrying a ghost for too long, and finally realizing you can let it go without ceremony. He asked if we could start over, just like that, as if relationships had a reset button, as if time hadn't happened, as if the past was just a bad dream we could blink away in daylight. I said, "Start over from what? The part where I trusted you? Or the part where you broke me?" And for once, he didn't have a clever answer, just silence that said more than any apology ever could. The truth is, part of me had imagined this moment 100 times. Him coming back, realizing what he lost, but in every version, I was the one still needing closure, still hurting, still unsure. But now, I was sure. I was whole. And I didn't need him to understand that for it to be true. Still, I let him talk a little longer, out of mercy or curiosity, I'm not sure, because something about watching him try, after all this time, was like watching a sunset you used to chase. Beautiful, maybe, but no longer necessary. When he finally stood to leave, bouquet untouched, I didn't stop him, didn't ask him to stay, didn't even look back. Because I wasn't the same woman who once believed his promises were worth more than peace. I didn't sleep much the night before he and I agreed to meet again. Not because I was nervous or hopeful, but because my mind kept wandering through every corner of our shared past, like walking barefoot across the floorboards of a house you no longer live in, but still remember how the light used to fall in the kitchen at 5 p.m. When I finally got out of bed, the sky was the color of soft linen, muted and gray, like a memory that no longer hurts but still lingers in your chest. I made myself a cup of coffee, the kind he never liked, strong, bitter, unfiltered, and sat on the balcony where I'd once cried after one of our bigger fights, staring at the streets below that now held no trace of him. He arrived right on time, bouquet in hand again, but this time something in his expression told me he knew. He wasn't here to win me back, so not really. He was here to see if the door was still open. And I was here to finally close it, gently and kindly, like you'd close the door of a childhood room you no longer need to return to. We took a walk through the nearby park, and as we passed by couples sitting under trees and kids chasing pigeons, I realized how quiet we both were, not from discomfort, but from mutual understanding that some silences are kinder than conversations. He asked me how I'd been, and I told him honestly, I was doing better. I'd found a rhythm without him, discovered a version of myself that wasn't constantly trying to hold things together. I started painting again, met new people, even traveled to Lisbon last fall. Oh, something I'd always wanted, but never dared to do while married to him because he hated flying and I hated leaving him. He smiled, and it wasn't the smile of someone jealous or bitter. It was the kind of smile you give when you're proud of someone, even if you're not part of their story anymore. Then he told me he was moving to a new job in another city, a fresh start, he said. And I realized that this was it. This was the part where two people who once thought they'd grow old together now just shared a bench, a view, and a moment of peace. We talked about old friends, laughed a little about how naive we both were at 27, and even about the dog we almost adopted but didn't. It was strange. So much love had passed between us, and yet here we were, two people at peace with the fact that we couldn't love each other right. At one point, he looked at me, his eyes soft, and said, "I really did love you, Lisa. I just didn't know how to keep it safe." I didn't cry, not because it didn't move me, but because I'd cried those tears already, in private, on nights when he wasn't there and I was still hoping he'd show up. I reached for his hand, gave it a brief, warm squeeze, and replied, "And I loved you too. But love isn't always enough to build a life. Sometimes it's just enough to remember someone kindly. We parted ways at the park gate. No promises, no regrets. Just a shared look and a smile that said, we did the best we could. As he walked away, the wind carried a faint trace of his cologne, one I used to hate but now found oddly comforting. I watched until he disappeared into the crowd, then turned and walked the other way, lighter, freer, and no longer searching for something I already had within me. And as I walked home, I thought, some people come into your life not to stay, but to show you who you are when you're finally alone. I was enough, and I always had been. And to every woman listens to this, never forget, you don't need to be chosen to be worthy. You are whole, even when you're alone. Your peace, your joy, your strength, they were never meant to depend on anyone else. Keep choosing yourself, always.